There's nothing quite like the silence that follows losing the person you thought you'd grow old with. Harold McKenna knew that silence well. It had filled every corner of his Iowa farmhouse for 3 long years since Martha passed away. At 72, his world had shrunk to just him and his old mare, Daisy, the only living thing that still seemed to need him. Every morning he'd bring her oats and talk to her like she understood every word, because frankly, she was better company than most people he'd known. That Tuesday morning started just like any other, but when Harold's hands found a strange lump on Daisy's side, his heart sank. He'd lost too much already to ignore something like this. So he called Dr. Sarah Chen, the young veterinarian who'd always been kind to an old man and his horse. But when she examined Daisy and went completely silent, Harold knew something was terribly wrong. What she saw made her face go pale and her voice disappear. What could possibly make a veterinarian react like that? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold McKenna had been rising at 5:30 every morning for 54 years, and this Tuesday was no different. The old farmhouse creaked its familiar greeting as his weathered hands reached for the coffee pot, the same ceramic one Martha had bought at the county fair in 1978. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her baking, though that was probably just his imagination playing tricks on him again. Outside, the Iowa countryside stretched endlessly under a pale October sky, the corn already harvested, leaving behind stubbled fields that looked as tired as Harold felt. This land had been in his family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, who'd homesteaded here back when the railroad first came through. Every acre held memories, where he'd learned to drive the old John Deere, where Martha had insisted on planting her vegetable garden despite his protests about the soil being too sandy, where their children had built forts in the hay bales during endless summer afternoons. But those children were grown now, scattered like seeds on the wind. Rebecca lived in Chicago, working at some big law firm and sending Christmas cards with photos of grandchildren he barely knew. His son Tommy had died in Afghanistan 12 years ago, and some days Harold still found himself listening for the sound of his truck coming up the gravel drive. The walk to the barn took longer these days. His left knee, the one he'd injured falling off a ladder in '89, complained with every step. Martha used to tease him about walking like an old cowboy, bow-legged and careful. Now there was no one to notice how he moved, no one to worry if he didn't come in for lunch on time. Daisy nickered softly when she heard his approach, her brown eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that made Harold believe horses understood more than people gave them credit for. She was 12 years old, a Missouri foxtrotter with a gentle disposition and a coat the color of rich coffee. Martha had found her at an auction, insisting they needed a horse, despite Harold's practical objections about feed costs and vet bills. "She's got kind eyes," Martha had said, running her hand along Daisy's neck. "Kind eyes and a good heart. That's all that matters." Harold had grumbled about women and their impulses, but he'd written the check anyway. Best decision he'd ever made, as it turned out. After Martha's funeral, when the house felt too quiet and the walls seemed to press in around him, Daisy had become his anchor. She listened to his complaints about the weather, his worries about the property taxes, his quiet confessions about how much he missed the sound of Martha's voice, calling him in for supper. "Morning, girl," he murmured, measuring out her oats. "Sleep well? I heard the wind picking up around midnight. Storm coming, I think." Daisy whuffled against his shoulder, her way of saying good morning. Harold's routine was as predictable as sunrise. Feed Daisy, check the water trough, walk the fence line looking for damage, then back to the house for a breakfast of black coffee and whatever was easy to fix. Usually that meant toast or leftover cornbread, sometimes eggs if he felt ambitious. He was running his hands along Daisy's sides, checking for cuts or swelling the way Martha had taught him, when his fingers found it. A hard lump about the size of a golf ball, just behind her left shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. "What's this, girl?" He pressed gently, feeling the mass beneath her coat. Daisy shifted but didn't flinch, which somehow made it worse. If it didn't hurt, that might mean it was something serious. Harold had learned that lesson the hard way with Martha, who'd complained about feeling tired for months before they finally found the cancer. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his old flip phone. Dr. Sarah Chen had given him her direct number 2 years ago, when Daisy had colicked, telling him never to hesitate to call if he was worried about anything. She was young, maybe 35, and had moved to their small town from Des Moines to take over old Dr. Peterson's practice. Harold had been skeptical at first. What did a city veterinarian know about farm animals? But she'd proven herself competent and patient, never making him feel foolish for his concerns. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Dr. Chen." "Sarah, it's Harold McKenna. I'm sorry to bother you, but I found something on Daisy that doesn't look right." "No bother at all, Harold. What did you find?" He described the lump, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah asked a few questions. How long might it have been there? Was Daisy eating normally? Any changes in her behavior? Harold answered as best he could, but the truth was, he might not have noticed it yesterday or the day before. He'd been distracted lately, spending too much time sitting in Martha's chair, and not enough time really paying attention to the world around him. "I can be there in about an hour," Sarah said. "Try not to worry too much until I can take a look." But Harold was already worrying. After Martha died, Daisy had become more than just a horse. She was proof that something in his life still needed him, still depended on his care. The thought of losing her felt like staring into an abyss he might not climb back out of. He spent the next hour pacing between the house and the barn, checking on Daisy every few minutes, as if the lump might disappear if he looked often enough. She seemed fine, nosing around her feed bucket and standing peacefully in her stall, but Harold had learned not to trust appearances. Martha had seemed fine too, right up until she wasn't. When Dr. Chen's truck finally turned into the driveway, Harold felt his chest tighten. She climbed out, wearing her usual uniform of jeans and a veterinary clinic shirt, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd been kind to him over the years, always taking time to explain what she was doing and why, never rushing through her visits, even though he knew she had other calls to make. "How are you holding up, Harold?" she asked, pulling her medical bag from the truck. "Been better," he admitted. "Been worse too, I suppose." In the barn, Sarah ran her hands expertly along Daisy's body, her expression professional and focused. When she found the lump Harold had discovered, she spent a long time examining it, pressing gently from different angles, feeling around the surrounding area. Harold watched her face, looking for clues about what she was thinking, and that's when he saw it, the moment when her professional composure cracked just slightly. Her hands stilled, and she went very quiet, the kind of quiet that meant bad news was coming. Harold had heard that same quality of silence from Martha's oncologist 3 years ago. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Sarah stepped back from Daisy, her face pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. For a long moment, she just stared at the horse, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. "I need to run some tests," she finally said, but her voice had changed. Gone was the confident veterinarian who'd been treating his animals for 2 years. In her place stood a woman who looked like she'd seen a ghost. Harold watched Dr. Chen's hands shake as she reached into her medical bag, pulling out instruments he didn't recognize. The confident veterinarian who had walked into his barn 15 minutes ago seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who looked like she was fighting an internal battle. "Sarah?" Harold's voice carried the weight of a man who had buried too many loved ones. "What aren't you telling me?" She glanced up at him, her dark eyes clouded with something that looked suspiciously like fear. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, Harold. Let me get some samples, and we'll know more in a few days. But Harold had lived long enough to read the spaces between words. The way she avoided his eyes, the careful neutrality of her voice, the slight tremor in her hands as she prepared a syringe, it all pointed to news he wasn't ready to hear. "You've seen this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's hands stilled on her equipment. For a moment, the only sound in the barn was Daisy's gentle breathing and the distant call of a crow from the oak tree outside. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mentor, Dr. Reynolds, had a case like this when I was in my residency. A mare, about Daisy's age, same type of mass in almost the exact same location." She swallowed hard, and Harold saw her professional mask slip entirely. The owner was an elderly man who lived alone. That horse was everything to him. Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened? The mass was malignant, aggressive. By the time we caught it, it had already started spreading. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "We tried everything, surgery, chemotherapy, experimental treatments. Nothing worked. The horse suffered for months, and when she finally died, her owner..." She stopped abruptly, shaking her head. "What happened to the owner, Sarah?" She looked up at him then, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "He died 3 weeks later. Heart attack, they said. But Dr. Reynolds always believed he just gave up, lost the will to keep going." The barn fell silent, except for the sound of Harold's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He reached out with one weathered hand to touch Daisy's neck, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse of life beneath his fingers. She turned her head toward him, those intelligent brown eyes studying his face with what looked like concern. "But you don't know for sure," Harold said, grasping for hope. "Not yet." "No," Sarah agreed, but her tone suggested she was already fairly certain. "I need to do a fine needle aspirate. Take some cells from the mass and send them to the lab. We'll also need blood work to check her overall health status. But Harold..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this might be serious." Harold nodded slowly, though his mind was racing. How long had the lump been there? How had he missed it? He thought of all the times over the past few weeks when he'd given Daisy a perfunctory pat instead of the thorough check she deserved, too lost in his own grief and loneliness to pay proper attention to the one living thing that still depended on him. "How long do the tests take?" he asked. 48 to 72 hours for the cell analysis. Blood work should be back tomorrow." Sarah was moving with more confidence now, falling back into her professional routine as a way to cope with her own emotions. "I'll put a rush on everything." Harold watched as she cleaned an area of Daisy's neck and inserted a thin needle, drawing blood into several vials. Daisy stood patiently, trusting, unaware that these samples might determine whether she had weeks or years left to live. The thought made Harold's chest tight with anxiety. When Sarah moved to take samples from the lump itself, Harold had to look away. The sight of the needle disappearing into that hard mass made everything feel too real, too immediate. He found himself thinking about Martha's final months, the endless cycle of tests and treatments, and waiting for results that never brought good news. "There," Sarah said, sealing the samples in small containers. "I'll drive these to the lab myself this afternoon." "What do I do now?" Harold asked. The question came out smaller than he'd intended, revealing more vulnerability than he was comfortable showing. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. "You take care of her the same way you always have. Keep her comfortable, watch for any changes in her appetite or behavior, and try not to let your mind run away with worst-case scenarios. And if it is what you think it is, then we'll discuss options. There are treatments available, depending on how advanced it might be. Surgery is sometimes possible, and there are medications that can help manage symptoms and improve quality of life." She paused. "But Harold, I need you to understand that if this is what I suspect, the prognosis isn't usually favorable for horses Daisy's age." The words hit him like a physical blow. Harold had to grip the stall door to steady himself. As the implications sank in, Daisy might be dying. The one constant in his life since Martha passed. The one living thing that got him out of bed every morning and gave his days structure and purpose might be taken from him too. How long? He managed to ask. I don't know yet. Let's wait for the test results before we start making those kinds of decisions. Sarah's professional compassion was evident, but Harold could see she was struggling with her own emotions. I'll call you the moment I hear anything. After she left, Harold stood in the barn for a long time, just watching Daisy eat her hay. She seemed completely normal, alert, hungry, content. It was hard to believe that something malignant might be growing inside her, stealing her future one cell at a time. He thought about the elderly man Sarah had mentioned, the one who died. 3 weeks after losing his horse, Harold understood that kind of grief, the way it could hollow you out until there was nothing left but the shell of who you used to be. When Martha died, he'd felt that same emptiness, that sense that the best parts of his life were over, and all that remained was waiting for the end. But he'd had Daisy then. She'd given him a reason to get up, to keep moving, to maintain some semblance of routine. Without her, Harold shook his head, forcing himself to stop that line of thinking. The tests might come back negative. The lump might be benign, or it might be something treatable. He couldn't start grieving for a horse who was still very much alive, still depending on him for care and companionship. But as he walked back to the house, Harold couldn't shake the image of Dr. Chen's pale face, or the fear he'd seen in her eyes when she first examined that lump. Some part of him already knew what the tests were going to reveal, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. The old rotary phone in Harold's kitchen had been silent for most of the 3 years since Martha's funeral, except for the occasional telemarketer or wrong number. Now, as he stared at it Wednesday evening, the black receiver seemed to mock him with its weight and the difficulty of the conversation he was about to attempt. He'd spent the entire day in a fog of worry, checking on Daisy every hour despite knowing that nothing would change until Dr. Chen called with the test results. The horse seemed blissfully unaware of the shadow hanging over her future, grazing peacefully in the pasture and coming to the fence when Harold approached, as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed, at least in Harold's mind. The discovery of that lump had shattered the fragile equilibrium he'd built over the past 3 years, the careful routine that had kept him functional, if not exactly happy. Now, uncertainty gnawed at him like a physical ache, and he found himself thinking about things he'd spent years avoiding: loneliness, mortality, the question of what would happen to him if he truly was left with no one. The phone number was written on a piece of paper that had been taped to the refrigerator for 2 years, ever since Rebecca had moved to her current apartment in Chicago. Harold had memorized the digits long ago, but had never found the courage to dial them. Not since that awful fight they'd had at Martha's funeral about him selling the farm and moving to the city. His fingers felt clumsy as he dialed, and for a moment he hoped she wouldn't answer. But on the 3rd ring, her familiar voice came through the line. "Hello, Rebecca. It's your father." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Harold to wonder if the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her tone was carefully neutral. "Dad, this is unexpected. Is everything okay?" Harold almost laughed at the question. Was everything okay? His wife was dead. His son was buried in Arlington Cemetery. His only remaining companion was a horse who might be dying of cancer, and he hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in months. But admitting any of that would require a kind of vulnerability he wasn't sure he could manage. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you and the kids are doing." Another pause. Rebecca had inherited Martha's ability to hear what wasn't being said, and Harold could practically feel her parsing his words for hidden meaning. "The kids are good. Emma made honor roll again, and Jake just started soccer season. They're growing. So fast. Emma's almost as tall as I am now." Her voice warmed slightly as she talked about her children. "They ask about you sometimes. About the farm. Harold felt a pang of something that might have been regret. His grandchildren were strangers to him, faces in Christmas photos and brief voices on speakerphone during obligatory holiday calls. He'd convinced himself that was better for everyone. Children didn't need to be burdened with a sad old man's grief. But now he wondered if that had been another mistake in a life that seemed increasingly full of them. "That's good," he said, unsure how to respond to the implicit invitation in her words. "Soccer's a good sport, builds character." The conversation limped along for another few minutes, both of them dancing around the real questions they wanted to ask. Rebecca wanted to know why he was really calling, and Harold wanted to know if there was any chance she might forgive him for pushing her away when she'd tried to help after Martha's death. But neither of them knew how to bridge the gulf that had opened between them. "Dad," Rebecca said finally, "are you sure you're okay? You sound, I don't know, different." Harold closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. For a moment, he considered telling her about Daisy, about Dr. Chen's worried expression, about the way fear had been eating at him all day. But what would be the point? Rebecca lived 4 hours away and had her own life, her own responsibilities. The last thing she needed was to worry about her stubborn father and his problems. "I'm fine," he repeated. "Just getting older, I suppose. Listen, I should let you go. I know you're busy." "Dad, wait." But Harold was already hanging up, his heart pounding as if he'd just run a mile. The conversation had gone about as well as he'd expected, which was to say it had been awkward and unsatisfying, and had left him feeling more isolated than before. The house felt oppressively quiet after Rebecca's voice disappeared. Harold found himself walking from room to room, touching objects that Martha had chosen and arranged, wondering what would happen to all of it when he was gone. Who would want her collection of ceramic roosters? Who would care about the quilt her grandmother had made, or the wedding china they'd used maybe a dozen times in 50 years of marriage? Thursday morning brought no relief from his anxiety. Harold woke before dawn from dreams he couldn't remember, but that left him feeling unsettled and tired. He went through his morning routine mechanically. Coffee, check on Daisy, walk the fence line, but everything felt different now, shadowed by uncertainty. It was while he was filling Daisy's water trough that Tom Bradley appeared at the fence. Tom owned the adjacent farm and had been Harold's neighbor for 15 years, though they'd never been particularly close. He was a decade younger than Harold, with a wife and teenage sons, and had always seemed to represent the kind of busy, connected life that Harold had somehow let slip away. "Morning, Harold," Tom called, leaning against the fence post. "How's everything going?" Harold looked up, surprised by the visit. Tom occasionally stopped by to discuss property line issues or to borrow equipment, but this felt different, more social, less purposeful. "Can't complain," Harold replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "Good to hear." Tom studied Harold's face with the kind of attention that suggested he was looking for something specific. "Sarah Chen mentioned she was out here yesterday. Everything okay with Daisy?" Harold's hands stilled on the water spigot. He'd forgotten how small their community was, how news traveled through informal networks of farmers and veterinarians and feed store clerks. Of course, Tom would know about Dr. Chen's visit. "Just a routine check," Harold said, but he could hear the lie in his own voice. Tom nodded slowly, clearly not buying it. "Well, if you need anything, help with chores, someone to keep an eye on. Things, you know where to find me. Linda's been after me to be a better neighbor anyway." The offer was casual, almost offhand, but Harold could hear the genuine concern underneath it. For a moment he felt a dangerous urge to accept, to admit that he could use some company, some help, some connection to the world beyond his shrinking existence. But pride and habit held him back. "I appreciate that, but I'm managing fine." Tom lingered for a few more minutes, talking about the weather and the corn harvest, and Harold found himself enjoying the conversation despite his determination to remain self-sufficient. It had been so long since he'd talked to someone who understood the rhythms of farm life, who could appreciate the subtle signs of changing seasons and the satisfaction of work well done. After Tom left, Harold stood by the fence for a long time, watching his neighbor's truck disappear down the gravel road. Maybe it was the stress of waiting for Daisy's test results, or maybe it was the echo of Rebecca's voice on the phone, but he felt more aware than usual of how quiet his world had become. Thursday evening came and went without word from Dr. Chen, and by Friday morning, Harold was pacing the farmhouse like a caged animal. He'd called the clinic twice, only to be told that the results weren't in yet, and that Dr. Chen would call as soon as she heard anything. The waiting was worse than any physical pain he'd ever endured. The unopened letter had been sitting on his kitchen table for 6 months, Rebecca's careful handwriting on the envelope, a daily reminder of conversations he wasn't ready to have. She sent one every few months. Not bills or business correspondence, but actual letters written on real paper, the kind Martha used to treasure. Harold had stopped opening them after the first few, unable to handle the mixture of love and disappointment. He heard in her written words, but now, with Dr. Chen's ominous silence stretching into its second day, that unopened envelope seemed to mock him with its patient presence. What if something happened to him? What if his heart gave out the way it had threatened to do during those first dark months after Martha's death? Rebecca would come to settle his affairs and find months of unopened letters, proof of how thoroughly he'd shut her out of his life. His hands shook slightly as he tore open the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Rebecca's neat script, and it began the way they all did. "Dear Dad, I hope this finds you well." She wrote about her children's activities, about her job, about small moments of daily life that she thought might interest him. Emma had lost her first tooth. Jake had learned to ride a bicycle. They'd visited the Lincoln Park Zoo, and the children had asked about the horses, wondering if Grandpa's horse was as big as the ones they'd seen there. But toward the end, Rebecca's tone shifted. "I know you think I don't understand why you want to stay on the farm, but I do. It's where you and Mom built your life together, where you raised us, where all your memories live. I'm not asking you to give that up. I just want to be part of your life again. The kids barely know you, Dad, and that breaks my heart. Not because I blame you. I know grief does terrible things to people, and I know you're doing the best you can. But they're growing up without their grandfather, and you're missing out on knowing these amazing little humans who are half Martha's grandchildren and half yours." Harold had to stop reading, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't expected. When had he become the kind of man who made his own daughter plead for his attention? When had protecting himself from further loss become more important than the relationships he still had? The phone rang just as he was folding the letter back into its envelope. Harold's heart jumped, hoping it was Dr. Chen with news, but Rebecca's name appeared on the caller ID. "Dad, I was hoping to catch you." Her voice was warm but tentative, as if she wasn't sure of her welcome. "Rebecca." Harold cleared his throat, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. I read your letter." "Oh." A pause. "The one from March, or did you finally open one of the more recent ones?" Harold felt heat rise in his cheeks. Of course she'd noticed that her letters weren't being acknowledged. "The one from March. I'm sorry, I should have—" "It's okay, Dad. I understand." But there was hurt in her voice, despite her attempt to hide it. "No, it's not okay." The words came out more forcefully than Harold had intended. "I've been a terrible father to you, especially since your mother died, and I've been a stranger to my own grandchildren. That's not okay, and I don't have any good excuse for it." The silence that followed was different from the awkward pauses of their previous conversation. This one felt expectant, as if Rebecca was waiting to see if he would continue or retreat back into familiar patterns of avoidance. "I've been scared," Harold admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Scared that if I let myself care too much about people again, I'll just lose them too." "I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Rebecca interrupted gently. "Dad, you lost Mom and Tommy within 5 years of each other. Of course you're scared. I just wish you hadn't decided that meant you had to lose me too." Harold closed his eyes, gripping the phone like a lifeline. I didn't mean for it to happen that way. I just didn't know how to be around people anymore, how to talk about normal things when everything felt so heavy. You don't have to be okay all the time, Rebecca said. You don't have to pretend that losing Mom didn't change everything. But you also don't have to go through it alone. They talked for almost an hour, longer than they'd spoken since before Martha's funeral. Rebecca told him about her children's personalities, their quirks and interests and dreams. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian and loved animals of all kinds. Jake was fascinated by farming and had been begging to visit his grandfather's farm since he was old enough to understand what a grandfather was. Maybe, Harold said carefully, maybe you could bring them for a visit sometime, if you think they'd be interested in seeing an old farm. Are you kidding? They'd be over the moon, Emma. Especially, she asks about Daisy every time we talk about you. Rebecca's voice brightened with excitement. We could come for a weekend, maybe next month when the weather's still nice. Harold's throat constricted. Next month seemed impossibly far away, given what Dr. Chen might tell him about Daisy's condition. But he couldn't explain that to Rebecca. He couldn't burden her with his fears about losing the one constant in his post-Martha life. That sounds wonderful, he managed. After they hung up, Harold sat in Martha's old rocking chair by the kitchen window, watching Daisy graze in the evening. Light. The conversation with Rebecca had left him feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified. Opening his heart to his family again meant risking more loss, more grief, more of the devastating emptiness that had nearly destroyed him when Martha died. But it also meant that Emma and Jake might get to know their grandfather before it was too late. It meant Rebecca might forgive him for the years of distance and silence. It meant he might not have to face whatever was coming next completely alone. As if summoned by his thoughts, Dr. Chen's truck appeared in his driveway. Harold's stomach dropped as he watched her climb out, her expression unreadable in the fading light. She wasn't supposed to make house calls on Friday evenings, which meant this was either very good news or very bad news. "Harold!" she called, as he stepped out onto the porch. "Do you have a few minutes? I got the preliminary results back, and I thought you'd want to hear them in person rather than over the phone." Her tone was carefully neutral, the voice of a professional delivering news that would change everything. Harold nodded and led her toward the barn, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Whatever she was about to tell him, he knew his carefully. Constructed world was about to shift again, and he wasn't sure he had the strength left to rebuild it one more time. Dr. Chen stood in the barn doorway, her medical bag in one hand and a folder of papers in the other. The expression on her face told Harold everything he needed to know before she even opened her mouth. This wasn't the visit that would put his fears to rest. "The cell analysis came back inconclusive," she said without preamble. "The mass is definitely abnormal, but the pathologist needs more tissue to make a definitive diagnosis. I'm going to recommend a surgical biopsy." Harold felt the words hit him like cold water. "Surgery. Minor surgery," Sarah clarified quickly. "We'd sedate Daisy and remove a larger sample of the tissue. It's outpatient. She could come home the same day. But Harold, I need to be honest with you about what we're likely to find." She opened the folder and showed him images that meant nothing to him, microscopic cells that looked like abstract art. But Sarah's finger traced certain shapes and patterns as she explained what the lab had discovered. "These cellular structures are consistent with what we call an undifferentiated mass. In layman's terms, that usually means cancer, and it's typically the aggressive kind." She looked up at him with eyes full of compassion. "I've seen this before. Harold, the location, the rapid growth, the cell morphology, it all points to the same diagnosis." Harold sank onto the old wooden stool he kept in Daisy's stall, feeling suddenly lightheaded. How long? Without treatment. Maybe 2 to 3 months before she starts experiencing significant discomfort. With aggressive treatment, surgery to remove as much as possible, followed by chemotherapy, we might extend that to 6 months or A year, but the quality of life during treatment can be difficult. The numbers swirled in Harold's head like leaves in a windstorm. 2 months. Maybe 3. After 3 years of Daisy being his constant companion, his reason for getting up in the morning, his connection to the world beyond his own grief. The thought of losing her felt like watching the last light go out in a house that was already too dark. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. "If she were your horse?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, stroking Daisy's neck. "I don't know," she admitted. "It would depend on a lot of things. Her personality, how she handles stress, what kind of support system I had to help with her care during treatment. But Harold, there's something else we need to talk about." She pulled the stool close to his and sat down, her voice dropping to the tone reserved for difficult conversations. "I've been worried about you too. You've lost weight since I saw you last month, and you look like you haven't been sleeping well. When was the last time you saw your doctor?" Harold waved a dismissive hand. "I'm fine. Just worried about Daisy." "When did you last have a real meal? Something more substantial than coffee and toast?" The question caught him off guard. Harold tried to remember, but the days since discovering Daisy's lump had blurred together in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. He'd been living on coffee, and whatever was easiest to fix, which usually meant very little. "I eat enough," he said, but even he could hear the defensiveness in his voice. Sarah studied his face with the same clinical attention she'd given to Daisy's lump. "Harold, I'm going to say something that might make you angry, but I care about both you and Daisy too much to stay quiet. You're not taking care of yourself, and if something happens to you, what happens to her?" The words stung, because they were true. Harold had been so focused on the possibility of losing Daisy that he'd stopped paying attention to his own declining health. When had he last cooked a proper meal? When had he last slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat? "I can manage," he said, but the protest sounded weak even to him. "I'm sure you can, but why should you have to manage alone?" Sarah's voice was gentle, but firm. "Harold, you have people in your life who care about you. Your neighbor Tom has stopped by the clinic twice this week asking about Daisy, which really means he's asking about you. Your daughter called my office yesterday, wanting to know if there was anything she could do to help." Harold's head snapped up. "Rebecca called you? She's worried about you. She said you sounded different when you talked to her, and she wanted to make sure you were okay. I couldn't give her details about Daisy's condition without your permission, but I could hear the concern in her voice." The thought of Rebecca worrying about him from 4 hours away made Harold's chest tight with guilt. He'd spent so much energy trying to protect himself from further loss that he'd failed to consider how his isolation affected the people who loved him. "What did you tell her?" "That if she was concerned, she should trust her instincts." Sarah paused. "Harold, would it be okay if I called her and explained Daisy's situation? With your permission, of course. She might want to be here for the biopsy or for whatever comes after." The idea of Rebecca dropping everything to rush to his side because his horse was sick felt both appealing and mortifying. She had her own life, her own responsibilities, her own children to worry about. But some selfish part of him desperately wanted her there, wanted someone to share the weight of decisions he didn't feel qualified to make alone. "Let me think about it," he said. They scheduled Daisy's biopsy for the following Tuesday. Sarah would pick her up early in the morning and have her back home by evening, with results expected within 48 hours. The weekend ahead stretched before Harold like a vast empty space that needed to be filled somehow. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, trying to force down a can of soup that tasted like cardboard, Harold found himself reaching for Martha's old recipe box. It was a wooden container she'd kept on the counter, filled with index cards covered in her careful handwriting, recipes collected over 50 years of marriage, from their first apartment to their final years on the farm. He pulled out a card. At random, Martha's famous pot roast, the one she'd made every Sunday during the winter months. The ingredients list was simple enough, but as Harold read through the instructions, he realized how many of the steps he'd forgotten. Martha had made cooking look effortless, but that was because she'd been doing it for decades, perfecting her techniques through repetition and love. Harold hadn't cooked a real meal since the funeral. For 3 years, he'd survived on sandwiches and canned goods and the occasional casserole from well-meaning neighbors. But suddenly, the idea of preparing Martha's pot roast felt important. Not just for the nutrition he desperately needed, but as a way of connecting with memories that brought comfort instead of pain. The grocery store trip was an adventure in itself. Harold hadn't been shopping for anything beyond basic supplies in months, and he found himself wandering the aisles like a tourist in a foreign country. But gradually, he assembled the ingredients Martha's recipe required. A good roast, fresh, vegetables, herbs, and seasonings he'd forgotten existed. Back home, he cleared space on the kitchen counter and laid out the recipe card like a roadmap. Martha's handwriting seemed to guide him through each step, her voice echoing in his memory as he seasoned the meat and chopped vegetables. It felt like having her there with him, sharing one more meal across the years that separated them. Harold was burning the onions when Dr. Chen's truck pulled into his driveway Sunday evening. He'd been so absorbed in following Martha's recipe that he hadn't noticed the smell of caramelizing vegetables crossing the line into something closer, to charcoal. The smoke alarm chose that moment to announce his failure with its shrill protest. "Everything okay in there?" Sarah called through the screen door as Harold waved a dish towel at the detector. "Just fine," he called back, though the evidence suggested otherwise. "Come on in, I'm attempting to cook." Sarah stepped into the kitchen and surveyed the scene. Flour scattered across the counter, vegetable peelings in the sink, and the distinct aroma of culinary ambition meeting reality. But instead of the judgment Harold expected, her face lit up with something that looked like delight. "You're making pot roast," she observed, reading Martha's recipe card. "My grandmother had a similar recipe. The secret is getting the onions golden but not brown. They get bitter if you let them go too far." "Too late for that wisdom," Harold said ruefully, scraping the burnt bits from the pan. "I haven't cooked anything more complicated than scrambled eggs in 3 years. Martha always handled the kitchen. Mind if I help?" Sarah asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "I promise I won't take over, but 2 pairs of hands might prevent any more casualties." Harold found himself nodding, though accepting help still felt foreign after so many months of stubborn self-reliance. Sarah moved around his kitchen with the confidence of someone who understood both cooking and the delicate art of assistance without intrusion. "Start the onions again, but lower heat this time," she suggested, salvaging what she could from his previous attempt. "Tell me about Martha while you cook. What was she like in the kitchen?" The question caught Harold off guard, but as he began slicing fresh onions, the words came easier than he'd expected. He told Sarah about Martha's habit of tasting everything twice, once for seasoning, once just because she loved food, about how she'd hum while she cooked, old songs from the radio, her voice barely audible above the sizzle of the stove, about how she'd always made enough for leftovers even when it was just the 2 of them, because you never knew who might stop by hungry. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said quietly, adjusting the heat under the pot. "How long were you married?" 53. "Years next month." The words came out automatically, then hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd been thinking about their anniversary date as something that was coming, not something that would mark the 4th year of her absence. Sarah must have noticed his expression change because she quietly took over stirring the vegetables while Harold collected himself. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the kitchen filling with the familiar aromas of Sunday dinner. "Can I ask you something?" Harold said eventually. "Why did you become a veterinarian?" Sarah smiled, but there was sadness around the edges. "Because of my grandfather. He had a small ranch in California, and when I was little I spent every summer there. He taught me that animals trust us completely. They put their lives in our hands and never question whether we deserve that trust. I wanted to be worthy of it. What happened to him? Cancer. When I was in veterinary school. Same type, Daisy? Might have, actually. She paused in her stirring. I was supposed to graduate that spring, but I took a semester off to help take care of him. By the time he died, I'd missed too many classes to continue. Harold looked up from the carrots he was dicing. But you did graduate. Eventually. It took me an extra year, and I was older than most of my classmates when I finally started practicing. But I learned something important during that time with my grandfather. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be present when someone is suffering, even if you can't fix everything. The observation hung between them, heavy with meaning that went beyond veterinary care. Harold understood that Sarah was talking about more than her grandfather's illness, more than Daisy's uncertain prognosis. She was talking about the choice to remain engaged with life even when loss seemed inevitable. "Is that why you moved here from Des Moines?" Harold asked. "To be present for people like me and animals like Daisy?" "Partly, but also because I was tired of treating pets like products in an assembly line. In the city, you see 30 animals a day and barely have time to learn their names, let alone understand their relationships with their families. Here, I know every animal I treat, and most of their people too. It matters more." They were interrupted by the sound of a truck in the driveway. Harold glanced out the window to see Tom Bradley climbing out of his pickup, a covered dish in his hands. "Looks like you have company," Sarah observed. Harold dried his hands on a dish towel, suddenly aware of what Tom would think about finding the town veterinarian helping him cook Sunday dinner. Small communities thrived on speculation, and he wasn't sure he was ready for people to start talking about him and Sarah as anything more than a farmer and his animal doctor. But when Tom knocked and was invited in, his reaction was nothing but, "Please, surprise. Well, this is a sight for sore eyes," Tom said, grinning at the domestic scene. "Harold McKenna cooking a real meal, and with help no less. Linda's going to be so happy to hear this." He set his covered dish on the counter, a pan of his wife's cornbread, still warm from the oven. "We figured you might not be eating well with all this worry about Daisy," Tom explained. "Linda sent enough cornbread to feed half the county and specific instructions that you're not allowed to refuse it." Harold felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When had his neighbors started paying such close attention to his well-being? When had people who barely knew him begun to care? Whether he was eating properly or sleeping enough? "That's very kind," he managed. "Would you like to stay for dinner? There's more than enough." Tom's smile broadened. "I was hoping you'd ask. Linda's at her sister's for the weekend, and the house feels too quiet for a Sunday evening." As if drawn by the promise of community, more neighbors began appearing. First Mrs. Patterson from down the road, carrying a fresh salad and an excuse about having made too much. Then the Morrison family from the next farm over, with their teenage son who'd always been fascinated by Harold's old tractor. Before Harold knew it, his kitchen was full of people, his dining room table extended with leaves he hadn't used since Martha's last birthday, and conversation flowing around topics he'd forgotten he cared about. Crop yields and weather patterns, local politics, and high school football. The small dramas and celebrations that knit a community together. Sarah moved seamlessly among his neighbors, asking about their animals, remembering details from previous visits, making everyone feel welcome in Harold's suddenly crowded house. Harold watched her navigate the social dynamics with the same skill she brought to veterinary care, and found himself wondering when he'd stop noticing how beautiful she was when she smiled. The phone call came at 6:30 Tuesday morning, just as Harold was making his first cup of coffee. Dr. Chen's voice was tight with controlled emotion, the professional mask she wore when delivering bad news. "Harold, I need you to bring Daisy in this morning. The biopsy results came back and we need to discuss treatment options." Harold's stomach dropped, though he'd been expecting this call since the previous Friday. "It's cancer." "Yes. Soft tissue sarcoma, aggressive type." But Harold, There are things we can do. Surgery is possible, and there are medications that can help manage. I'll be there in an hour, Harold interrupted, unable to listen to treatment protocols when his world was crashing down around him. He found Daisy in her usual spot by the fence, nose deep in the morning hay he'd scattered there before dawn. She looked up at his approach, ears forward, trusting eyes reflecting a contentment that made Harold's heart break. How could something so vital, so present, be harboring cells that were systematically destroying her from within? Loading Daisy into the trailer felt like preparing for an execution. She stepped up the ramp willingly, as she always did, trusting Harold's judgment about where they were going and why. The drive to Dr. Chen's clinic passed in a blur of autumn countryside, leaves just beginning to turn, the kind of perfect fall, morning that should have filled Harold with appreciation for the season's beauty. Dr. Chen was waiting in the clinic's parking area, her expression grave but determined. She helped Harold unload Daisy and led them into an examination room that had been set up more like a comfortable living space than a medical facility. Soft lighting, a padded floor mat, even a small heater to ward off the morning chill. I wanted her to be comfortable while we talk, Sarah explained, settling onto a hay bale she'd positioned near Daisy's head. Harold, the tumor is larger than we initially thought, and it's growing faster than I hoped. Without treatment, she probably has 6 to 8 weeks before the pain becomes unmanageable. Harold sank onto the second hay bale, his legs suddenly unsteady. 6 to 8 weeks. Less than 2 months with the only living creature that still needed him, still gave his days purpose and structure. What are the treatment options? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Sarah pulled out a folder thick with medical charts and treatment protocols. Surgery to remove as much of the tumor as possible, followed by chemotherapy and radiation. It's aggressive treatment, and it would mean bringing Daisy here 3 times a week for the next several months. The side effects can be significant: nausea, fatigue, compromised immune system. What are her chances? With aggressive treatment, we might get her another year, possibly 18 months. But Harold, I need to be honest with you. The treatment itself is difficult. Some animals handle it well, but others find the process more traumatic than the disease. Harold ran his hand along Daisy's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath her warm coat. A year seemed like a lifetime right now, but at what cost? He thought of the past 3 years, how Daisy had been his anchor through the worst grief of his life. She deserved better than to spend her final months sick and frightened, surrounded by the sterile smells of medical treatment. There's another option, Sarah said quietly. We can focus on keeping her comfortable for as long as possible. Pain management, supportive care, letting her enjoy the time she has left without the stress of aggressive treatment. Palliative care. Yes, it's not giving up, Harold. It's choosing quality of life over quantity. Harold closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of decisions he didn't feel qualified to make. How do you choose between hope and peace for someone you love? How do you decide when fighting becomes suffering? I need to show you something, he said suddenly, pulling out his wallet. From behind his driver's license, he extracted a small photograph that had been there for over a decade. A picture of Martha in the barn, her arms around a much younger Daisy, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Sarah studied the photograph, her expression softening. Martha loved her too. Martha found her at an auction when Daisy was just 4 years old. I thought we were too old to take on a young horse, but Martha insisted. Harold's voice cracked slightly. She said Daisy had kind eyes and a gentle spirit, and that sometimes the heart knows things the head doesn't understand. She was right. Harold took the photograph back, holding it carefully between weathered fingers. The truth is, Sarah, I don't think I can survive losing Daisy. She's been the only thing keeping me connected to life since Martha died. Without her, he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, stroking Daisy's forehead. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Harold, can I tell you something that might be hard to hear? He nodded, bracing himself for more bad news. I think you're giving Daisy credit for something you've been doing yourself. Yes, she's been important to you, but you're the one who's been getting up every morning, taking care of her, maintaining the farm, staying connected to life. Daisy didn't do that for you. You did that because you love her. Harold looked up, confused by her logic. What I'm saying is that you're stronger than you think you are. Strong enough to love Daisy through whatever comes next, whether that's aggressive treatment or comfort care. Strong enough to make the decision that's best for her, even if it's not what you want for yourself. The words hit Harold with unexpected force. For 3 years, he'd been telling himself that Daisy was his lifeline, his reason for continuing. But Sarah was suggesting something different, that his love for Daisy was evidence of his own resilience, his own capacity to keep choosing life, even in the face of loss. I don't know how to let her go, he admitted. You don't have to figure that out today. But Harold, whatever you decide about treatment, you need to start thinking about what comes after. Daisy won't be with you forever, whether we have 6 weeks or 18 months. What will keep you connected to life when she's gone? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harold thought about the dinner party that had spontaneously formed in his kitchen 2 nights ago, about Rebecca's voice on the phone talking about her children, about the letters he'd been too afraid to open. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe Daisy hadn't been keeping him alive. Maybe love itself was what kept people connected to life, and love could take many forms. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them stroking Daisy's coat while she dozed peacefully between them. Finally, Harold spoke. If we do the comfort care option, how long do I have to make arrangements? What kind of arrangements? Harold thought about Rebecca's offer to visit with the children, about the conversation he needed to have with Tom Bradley, about someone checking on the farm, about all the ways he needed to prepare for a future that suddenly looked very different than the isolated existence he'd been maintaining. The kind that involved letting people back into my life, he said quietly. Harold spent that Tuesday evening walking through his farmhouse like a man taking inventory of his life. Every room held artifacts of the 53 years he and Martha had built together. Wedding photos, furniture they'd saved months to buy, Martha's reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand where she'd left them the morning she went into the hospital for the last time. In the bedroom closet, tucked behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and memory, he found the small, wooden box he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was Martha's Bronze Star, the medal she'd earned as an army nurse in Vietnam long before they'd met. She'd never talked much about the war, but Harold knew she'd saved lives under conditions that would have broken lesser people. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding the medal in his palm, remembering the woman who'd been brave enough to run toward danger when others ran away. That same courage had carried her through 53 years of marriage, through the heartbreak of losing their son, through her own final battle with cancer. And somehow, Harold had convinced himself that he was too weak to face life without her. The phone rang, interrupting his reflection. Rebecca's name appeared on the caller ID, and for once, Harold answered without hesitation. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation all week. I know you said maybe we could visit next month, but—" She paused, her voice uncertain. "I talked to Dr. Chen yesterday." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "She told you about Daisy." "Yes, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know how much she means to you." Rebecca's voice was thick with emotion. "But I also know you, and I know you're probably trying to handle this alone. I took some time off work. I want to come help. Rebecca, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Not because you can't manage, but because I want to be there. Because you shouldn't have to make these decisions by yourself, and because I've missed too much of your life already." Harold closed his eyes, Martha's medal still warm in his palm. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. I'm driving up with the kids. They're on fall break anyway, and Emma's beside herself with excitement about meeting Daisy." Rebecca paused. "Is that okay? I mean, with everything that's happening?" Harold thought about Emma, The granddaughter who wanted to be a veterinarian, meeting the horse who had been his closest companion through the darkest years of his life. There was something perfect about that timing, something Martha would have orchestrated if she'd been here to manage such things. "That's more than okay," he said. "That's exactly what I need." They talked for another hour, making practical arrangements and filling in the details of a visit that felt both long overdue and perfectly timed. Rebecca would stay in her old room, the one that still had her high school trophies on the dresser and the wallpaper she'd picked when she was 14. Emma and Jake would share the guest room, and Harold would have to figure out how to be a grandfather to children who barely knew him. After hanging up, Harold found himself moving through the house with new purpose. The guest room needed fresh sheets and a thorough dusting. The refrigerator was almost empty except for condiments and leftover pot roast. The front porch had a loose board that he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months. By Wednesday morning, Harold had accomplished more than he had in the previous 3 weeks combined. The house was clean. The refrigerator was stocked with foods he thought children might enjoy, and he'd even picked up some of Daisy's favorite apples from the orchard down the road. Dr. Chen arrived just as he was finishing his morning chores, her truck loaded with medical supplies and a portable X-ray machine. "I thought we should do a complete workup while your family is here," she explained, unloading equipment with practiced efficiency. "Update the X-rays, check her blood levels, make sure we have the most current information for whatever decisions you need to make." Harold helped her carry the equipment into the barn, where they'd set up a makeshift examination area. Daisy stood patiently while Sarah positioned the X-ray machine, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the anxiety Harold felt building in his chest. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, adjusting the settings on her equipment. Harold wasn't sure if she was talking about the X-rays or about having his family witness Daisy's decline, but the answer was the same either way. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The X-rays revealed what Sarah had expected but hoped not to find. The tumor had grown significantly since the previous week, spreading into surrounding tissue in a way that made surgical removal impossible. The images looked like storm clouds. To Harold's untrained eye, dark masses where there should have been clear tissue. "How long?" he asked quietly. 4 weeks, maybe less." "I'm sorry, Harold. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." 4 weeks. Less than a month with Daisy. Less than a month to figure out how to say goodbye to the last living connection to his life with Martha. The timeline felt both impossibly short and unbearably long. They were interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. Harold looked out to see Rebecca's SUV parked next to Sarah's truck. 2 children, tumbling out of the back seat with the boundless energy of youth suddenly set free after a long car ride. "Grandpa!" Emma called, running toward the barn with Jake close behind. "Where's Daisy? Mom said she's the most beautiful horse in Iowa." Harold felt his throat constrict as his granddaughter threw her arms around his waist in a hug that was both fierce and trusting. When had she gotten so tall? When had Jake developed those serious eyes that reminded Harold so much of his father at that age? "She's right here," Harold said, leading them to Daisy's stall. "But we need to be gentle. She's not feeling her best right now." Emma approached Daisy with the reverence of a child meeting something magical. She extended her hand palm up, waiting for Daisy to sniff her fingers before attempting to touch the horse's soft muzzle. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice filled with awe. "And she has kind eyes, just like Mom said." Harold glanced at Rebecca, who was standing in the barn doorway watching her daughter fall in love with the same horse that had captured Martha's heart 12 years ago. The parallel was so perfect, it felt like a gift from his late wife, a reminder that love had a way of continuing across generations if you were brave enough to let it. "Dr. Chen," Rebecca said, extending her hand to Sarah, "thank you for taking such good care of my father and Daisy." "Your father's been taking excellent care of both himself and Daisy," Sarah replied, but Harold caught the meaningful look she directed his way. "We've just been working together to make sure they both have everything they need." Over lunch, Harold found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, about the early days with Daisy, about Martha's insistence that horses were better, judges of character than most people, about the morning he'd found Daisy standing guard over a sick calf that had wandered into their pasture. Emma hung on every word, asking questions about horse care and veterinary medicine, while Jake quietly absorbed everything with the thoughtful attention he'd inherited from his grandfather. "Grandpa," Emma said as they walked back to the barn after lunch, "is Daisy going to die?" The question was so direct, so innocent in its honesty, that Harold found himself answering with the same straightforward truth. "Yes, sweetheart, she's very sick, and the medicine can't fix her. Are you sad?" "Very sad, but also grateful for all the time we've had together." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity of someone much older. "Will you get another horse after she goes to heaven?" Harold glanced back at Rebecca, who was walking behind them with Jake and Dr. Chen. The question Emma had asked was the same one that had been haunting him for weeks. What would his life look like after Daisy was gone? "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "What do you think I should do?" Emma considered this seriously. "I think you should do whatever would make Daisy happy. She loves you, so she probably wants you to keep loving other things, even when she can't be here anymore." The wisdom in her words took Harold's breath away. From the mouths of babes, Martha used to say, often came the truths adults were too complicated to see clearly. The decision came to Harold in the quiet hours before dawn on Thursday morning, as he stood in the barn watching Daisy sleep. She was lying down more often now, her breathing slightly labored, and when she did stand, Harold could see the effort it required. The strong, graceful horse who had carried him through 3 years of grief was fading, and no amount of denial could change that reality. He found the worn leather halter hanging on its usual peg, the same one Martha had used to train Daisy as a 4-year-old, soft with age and countless gentle encounters. Martha had always believed that how you approached an animal mattered as much as what you asked of them. Trust had to be earned through consistency, patience, and respect for the creature's dignity. Harold slipped the halter over Daisy's head, his fingers remembering the familiar routine even as his heart broke with the significance of this particular morning. Today would be the last time he performed this simple act of care. "Come on, girl," he murmured, leading her out of the stall. "Let's go see your favorite spot one more time." The pasture was silver with dew, the October air crisp enough to make their breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Harold had always loved this time of morning on the farm, the way the world felt fresh and full of possibility, the sense that he and the animals were the only living things awake to witness the day's beginning. Daisy walked beside him with the trust of a dozen years, occasionally dropping her head to crop a mouthful of grass. If she was in pain, she was too dignified to show it, carrying herself with the same quiet grace that had first caught Martha's attention at that long-ago auction. They stopped at the old oak tree where Martha used to sit and read on summer afternoons, where she'd planned her gardens and written in her journal about the changing seasons. Harold had avoided this spot for 3 years, unable to bear the weight of memory it carried. But today, it felt like exactly the right place to say goodbye. "Rebecca," Harold called softly toward the house. He'd left the back door open, hoping his voice would carry to the guest room where his family was still sleeping. A few minutes later, Rebecca appeared on the porch, still in her pajamas, but alert with the quick responsiveness of a mother accustomed to emergency calls. "Dad, is everything okay? Can you get the kids and Dr. Chen? I need to—" Harold's voice caught and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "I need to say goodbye to Daisy this morning." Rebecca's expression shifted to immediate understanding. She disappeared into the house without another word, and Harold could hear quiet movement and hushed conversations as she roused Emma, Jake, and Sarah from sleep. Dr. Chen arrived first, carrying her medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who had performed this service too many times to count, but never without feeling the weight of it. She approached Daisy with the same gentle confidence she'd shown during every visit, running her hands along the horse's neck and checking her breathing. "How is she?" Harold asked. "Comfortable for now, but you can see she's starting to struggle. You're making the right choice, Harold. This is love, not giving up." Emma and Jake appeared next, moving with the careful quiet of children who understood. Something important was happening. Emma had tears in her eyes, but she approached Daisy with the same fearless affection she'd shown yesterday. "Is this when Daisy goes to heaven?" she asked, stroking the horse's soft nose. "Yes, sweetheart," Harold said, kneeling beside his granddaughter, "but she's not scared, because she knows how much we love her." Jake, quieter by nature, but no less affected, stood close to Harold's other side. "Will it hurt?" Dr. Chen answered, in the gentle tone she reserved for children asking difficult questions. "No, it won't hurt. She'll just get very sleepy, and then her body won't hurt anymore." Harold watched his grandchildren process this information with the remarkable resilience of youth. They were sad, but they weren't afraid. They trusted the adults around them to handle this difficult situation with the care and dignity it deserved. "I want to tell her something," Emma said suddenly. Harold nodded, lifting his granddaughter so she could whisper into Daisy's ear. Whatever Emma said made Daisy's ears flick forward attentively, as if she was listening to every word. Jake asked to do the same, standing on tiptoe to share his own private message with the horse, who had already become important to him, despite knowing her for less than 24 hours. Rebecca's goodbye was longer, more complex. Harold watched his daughter rest her forehead against Daisy's neck, her shoulders shaking with tears she'd been holding back for his sake. "Thank you for taking care of my dad when I couldn't," she whispered, loud enough for Harold to hear. "Thank you for keeping him company and giving him something to love." When it was Harold's turn, the words he'd planned disappeared entirely. How do you summarize 12 years of companionship, of shared mornings and quiet conversations, of the way one creature's trust can anchor you to the world when everything else feels like it's falling apart? "You saved my life," he said simply, his voice breaking. "After Martha died, I didn't know how to keep going, but you gave me a reason. You've been the best friend an old man could ask for." Dr. Chen worked with practiced efficiency and infinite compassion, explaining each step as she prepared the medications that would allow Daisy to slip peacefully away. She positioned herself at Daisy's neck, finding the vein with gentle precision. "Are you ready?" she asked Harold. Harold looked around at his family, at Rebecca holding both children close, at the morning sun painting everything golden, at Daisy standing calmly in the place Martha had loved most on their farm. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt surrounded by love instead of isolated by grief. "We're ready," he said. The process was gentler than Harold had dared to hope. Daisy simply lowered her head gradually, her breathing becoming slower and deeper until it stopped entirely. There was no struggle, no fear, just the peaceful transition from life to whatever came after. Harold kept his hand on her neck until the very end, feeling the exact moment when her spirit left her body. The silence that followed was profound, but not empty. It felt full of all the love they'd shared, all the mornings and seasons and quiet conversations that had made up their life together. "She's gone," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Though they could all see the truth of it." Harold nodded, tears streaming down his face as he stroked Daisy's mane one final time. Emma slipped her small hand into his, and Jake moved closer to his other side. Rebecca's hand settled on his shoulder, and Dr. Chen remained nearby, a supportive presence who understood the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. "Thank you," Harold said to Sarah, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for letting her go peacefully. Thank you for loving her enough to let her go." Sarah replied, "That's the hardest part of loving anything, knowing when to hold on and when to let go." As they stood together in the morning light, Harold realized that something had shifted. The overwhelming grief he'd expected to feel was there, but so was something else, gratitude for the time they'd had, and amazement at how love could expand rather than diminish when shared with others. Daisy was gone, but he wasn't alone. He had his daughter, his grandchildren, and a community of people who cared about his well-being. Most importantly, he had learned that love itself was what connected him to life, not any single relationship or creature. The future was still uncertain, still frightening in its unknowns. But for the first time in 3 years, Harold felt capable of facing it with his heart open rather than closed. Tom Bradley arrived an hour later with a young oak sapling in the back of his truck, its roots carefully wrapped in burlap. He'd brought a shovel and an expression of quiet understanding that spoke to decades of farm life, where the cycles of birth and death were part of the natural order. "Thought Daisy might like a tree," he said simply, lifting the sapling with gentle care. "Oak trees live for centuries." Seemed fitting. Harold stood beside Daisy's still form, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of neighbors who understood that some losses required permanent remembrance. The oak tree would grow here long after Harold was gone, its roots drawing nourishment from the soil that would become Daisy's final resting place. "Where should we plant it?" Rebecca asked, her arm around Emma's shoulders. Harold looked around. The pasture, considering the morning light and the view from the farmhouse kitchen window. Martha had always said that memorial gardens should be places you'd want to visit, not places you'd feel obligated to avoid. "There," he said, pointing to a spot near the fence line where the tree would catch the morning sun but provide afternoon shade. She used to stand there during the hot summer days, watching the road for visitors. Emma helped carry the small tree, treating it with the reverence of someone participating in something sacred. Jake found smooth stones from the creek bed to mark the corners of what would become a memorial garden. Even Dr. Chen stayed to help, her professional obligations set aside in favor of being present for something that transcended veterinary care. Digging the hole was harder work than Harold had expected, the October ground firm and resistant. But Tom insisted on doing most of the labor, brushing aside Harold's protests with the kind of gentle stubbornness that characterized good neighbors. "Let me do this," Tom said, when Harold tried to take the shovel. "You've got more important things to think about right now." As Tom worked, Harold found himself talking about Daisy in a way he hadn't been able to before. Not just about her illness and death, but about the joy she'd brought to his life. He told them about the morning she'd escaped her stall, and he'd found her in Martha's vegetable garden, delicately eating tomatoes off the vine. About the way she'd learned to open gate latches with her teeth, and how she'd always known when storms were coming hours before the weather service issued warnings. "She sounds like she was quite a character," Dr. Chen said, smiling despite the sadness of the occasion. "Martha used to say that Daisy was too smart for her own good, but too sweet to get into real trouble." Harold's voice was steadier now, the act of sharing memories somehow making them feel less fragile. When the hole was ready, they lowered the sapling carefully into place, its small trunk straight and determined. Emma and Jake took turns adding soil around the roots, their small hands working alongside their grandfather's weathered ones. "Should we say something?" Rebecca asked when the tree was planted and watered. Harold looked around at the faces gathered. In his pasture, his daughter and grandchildren, his neighbor, the veterinarian who had become so much more than a professional service provider. These people had shown up for Daisy's death in the same way they'd shown up for his life over the past difficult days. "Daisy taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies," he said slowly. "It just changes form. She loved Martha, and when Martha was gone, Daisy loved me. And now that Daisy's gone, all that love is still here. It's just spread out among all of us." He paused, looking at the young oak tree that would grow and flourish long after they were all gone. "I think that's what Martha would have wanted. Not for the love to die with her, but for it to keep growing and changing and finding new ways to connect us to each other." Emma stepped forward and placed her small hand on the tree trunk. "I promise to come visit you, Daisy," she said solemnly. "And when I'm a veterinarian, I'll take care of horses just like Grandpa and Dr. Chen took care of you." The simple promise, delivered with such sincerity, made Harold's throat tight with emotion. This was how love continued, through children, who absorbed the lessons of their elders and carried them forward into the future. They spent the rest of the morning making arrangements for Daisy's body to be removed, a practical necessity that Tom handled with characteristic efficiency. Harold was grateful to have these details managed by people who understood that logistics were important but secondary to the emotional work of grieving. By afternoon, the pasture looked strangely empty without Daisy's familiar presence, but the young oak tree stood where they'd planted it, already seeming more established than it had that morning. Harold found himself checking on it every few hours, the way he'd once checked on Daisy. "It's going to be beautiful here," Rebecca said, joining him at the fence as the sun began to set. "Mom would have loved having a tree planted in her favorite spot." Harold nodded, realizing for the first time that this memorial was as much for Martha as it was for Daisy. The two loves of his life, connected by the oak tree that would outlive them all. "Rebecca," he said suddenly, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay. Do you think I wasted the last 3 years? Hiding away here, pushing people out, pretending that being alone was the same thing as being strong?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer with the care it deserved. "I think you did what you needed to do to survive losing Mom," she said finally, "but I also think you're ready to do something different now. Today proved that the way you let us all help with Daisy, the way you talked about her, the way you're thinking about the future instead of just enduring the present." Harold felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe the last 3 years hadn't been wasted time, but necessary time, the period of healing that had to happen before he could risk loving and losing again. "I want to be a better grandfather to Emma and Jake," he said. "I want to know them, really know them, not just see them in Christmas photos. They'd love that. Emma hasn't stopped talking about the horses she's going to have when she grows up, and Jake keeps asking Tom about tractors and farming." Harold smiled, imagining his grandchildren growing up with some connection to the land that had shaped so many generations of his family. "And Sarah," Rebecca continued carefully, "she seems like a very special person." Harold felt heat rise in his cheeks. "She's been a good friend. Dad, she stayed here all morning to help you say goodbye to Daisy. That goes beyond professional obligation." Harold looked across the pasture to where Dr. Chen was loading her equipment into her truck, preparing to leave after spending the entire day supporting him through one of the most difficult experiences of his life. "I'm 72 years old, Rebecca. I don't know if I have the energy to start over with someone new." "You don't have to start over," his daughter said gently. "You just have to keep going, and maybe let someone walk beside you while you do it." 6 months later, Harold McKenna sat at his kitchen table on a warm April morning, writing in a leather-bound journal that had been Rebecca's Christmas gift. The pages were filling slowly but steadily with stories he'd never bothered to record. Memories of Martha, observations about farm life, letters to his grandchildren about the lessons he'd learned too late to teach their father. Through the window, he could see the oak tree they'd planted in Daisy's memory, its branches now thick with new leaves. Emma had been right about it being beautiful. The tree had grown with surprising vigor, as if nourished by all the love that had been planted with it. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread, evidence of the cooking lessons Sarah had been giving him over the past few months. Harold still burned the occasional batch of biscuits, but he could now prepare a decent meal without requiring emergency intervention. More importantly, he'd rediscovered the pleasure of sharing food with people he cared about. "Morning," Sarah said, letting herself in through the back door with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there. She carried a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery in town, her contribution to their standing Tuesday morning breakfast. "Morning," Harold replied, closing the journal and moving to clear space on the table. "How did the Henderson calf do overnight?" "Much better. Fever broke around 3 this morning, and she was nursing again by dawn." Sarah settled into the chair that had gradually become hers, the one with the best view of the memorial garden. I think she's going to be fine. These Tuesday mornings had started accidentally. Sarah stopping by to check on Harold a week after Daisy's death, finding him struggling with a bout of insomnia and loneliness. One cup of coffee had turned into breakfast, which had turned into a standing appointment that neither of them wanted to break. Harold poured coffee from Sarah's thermos, adding cream the way she liked it. The routine was comfortable now, domestic in a way that would have terrified him 6 months ago, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Rebecca called last night," he said, settling into his own chair. "They're planning to come. For Memorial Day weekend, Emma wants to plant flowers around Daisy's tree." "That sounds perfect. What kind of flowers?" "Wildflowers," she said, "the kind that come back every year without much fuss." Harold smiled at the memory of his granddaughter's careful planning. She's been reading gardening books from the library, taking notes like she's preparing for a test. At 9 years old, Emma had developed an obsession with both veterinary medicine and horticulture that impressed even Sarah. During their monthly visits, she asked detailed questions about animal care and plant growth, absorbing information with the intensity of someone who had found her calling early. Jake, meanwhile, had formed an alliance with Tom Bradley, spending hours learning about farm equipment and crop rotation. At 7, he could already identify different types of corn by their leaves and explain why some fields were planted with soybeans while others grew alfalfa. "And how are you doing with all these visits?" Sarah asked, spreading jam on a piece of fresh bread. "I know having people around was hard for you at first." Harold considered the question seriously. The transition from isolation to regular social contact had been more difficult than he'd expected, requiring energy he'd forgotten he possessed, but it had also been worth every moment of discomfort. "Better than I thought I would," he admitted. "I actually look forward to them now. The house feels too quiet when they leave." It was true. The farmhouse had come alive again over the past months, filled with Emma's laughter and Jake's endless questions, Rebecca's patient guidance, and Sarah's quiet presence. Harold had rediscovered the pleasure of cooking for people, of planning, activities around someone else's interests, of being needed for reasons beyond basic survival. Tom Bradley had become a regular dinner guest, often bringing Linda and their teenage sons for Sunday meals that stretched late into the evening. The dining room table, unused for so long, now required all its extension leaves to accommodate the growing circle of people who had become Harold's chosen family. "I've been thinking," Harold said carefully, "about getting another horse." Sarah looked up from her breakfast, eyebrows raised with interest rather than surprise. They'd discussed this possibility before, usually in theoretical terms, but Harold's tone suggested he was moving beyond speculation. "What kind of thinking?" "There's a mare at the Patterson place. They're moving to Florida and need to find homes for their animals. She's older, gentle, not the kind of horse that needs training or intensive care. Just companionship." Harold had visited the Patterson farm twice over the past month, drawn by Tom's casual mention that they had a horse who needed a home. Buttercup was 15 years old, a stocky quarter horse with kind eyes and a patient temperament. She reminded Harold of Daisy in all the ways that mattered, intelligent, affectionate, content to share her days with a human who understood the rhythm of farm life. "Have you spent time with her?" 3 visits. She likes apples and doesn't mind. Having her feet picked, Mrs. Patterson says she's been lonely since their other horse died last year. Sarah smiled, recognizing the careful way Harold was building his case. "Sounds like you've both been lonely, maybe. But I'm not looking for her to replace Daisy or fill some hole in my life. I just think I have enough love left to share with another animal who could use a home." The distinction was important, and Sarah understood why Harold needed to make it clear. This wouldn't be the desperate attachment of a grieving man clinging to his last connection to life. This would be a choice made from abundance rather than scarcity, from a heart that had learned to love multiple things without diminishing any of them. When would you bring her home? Next week, if you think it's a good idea. Rebecca's excited about the kids having a horse to visit, and Emma's already planning Buttercup's first veterinary checkup. They finished breakfast while making practical plans, updating the barn, ordering feed, scheduling Buttercup's initial health assessment. The conversation was punctuated by comfortable silences and shared glances out the window toward the memorial garden, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom around the base of Daisy's oak tree. "Harold," Sarah said as she prepared to leave for her morning appointments, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. Watching you these past months, seeing you open your heart again after everything you've lost, it's been one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. You've taught me something important about resilience." Harold felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I think you have that backward. You're the one who taught me about resilience, about staying present even when the outcome isn't what you want." Maybe we taught each other. After Sarah left, Harold returned to his journal, trying to capture the feeling of this particular morning. The contentment of shared breakfast, the anticipation of Buttercup's arrival, the gradual accumulation of small joys that had replaced the overwhelming grief of the previous year. He wrote about Emma's letters, full of horse drawings and veterinary questions, about Jake's careful observations of farm equipment and his growing friendship with Tom's sons, about Rebecca's monthly calls that now felt like connections rather than obligations. Most of all, he wrote about the lesson it had taken him 72 years to fully understand, that love wasn't a finite resource that got used up when people died. Love was more like the oak tree in his pasture, something that grew stronger and more expansive over time, creating shade and shelter for anyone wise enough to rest beneath its branches. The future stretched ahead of him, still uncertain, but no longer frightening. There would be more losses, that was the price of loving anything. But there would also be more connections, more shared meals, more quiet mornings spent planning gardens and caring for animals and writing letters to grandchildren who were growing up knowing they had a grandfather who loved them completely. Harold closed the journal and walked out to check on the memorial garden, where wildflowers were beginning to push through the soil around Daisy's tree. By the time Emma arrived for her next visit, there would be blooms to admire and stories to share about the horse who would soon join their family. Standing in the morning sunshine, Harold could almost hear Martha's voice carried on the spring breeze telling him what she'd always known, that the heart capable of great love was also capable of great healing, and that the best way to honor those who were gone was to keep living fully in their memory. The oak tree rustled its new leaves in agreement, and Harold smiled, finally at peace with both his past and his future.